Picture this. You're 13 years old, draped in cloth of gold that weighs more than your frail body can bear. The year is 1578, and you stand before a mirror in the Alcazar Palace of Madrid, watching your reflection fracture in the polished silver like broken glass. Your jaw juts forward unnaturally, making it impossible to close your mouth properly. Saliva pools at the corners of your lips, which your lady-in-waiting dabs away with silk handkerchiefs, her eyes never meeting yours. The Habsburg chin, they call it. The mark of divine blood, but you know better. You've seen the portraits of your ancestors lining these halls, each face more distorted than the last, each smile more forced. Your spine curves like a question mark beneath layers of whalebone and velvet. Walking requires concentration, each step a careful negotiation with gravity and grace. The other girls at court whisper when you pass, not from cruelty, but from the kind of morbid fascination reserved for beautiful disasters. Tonight, you'll meet your betrothed, your uncle, or perhaps your cousin. The genealogists can't quite agree which branch of the family tree connects you. Not that it matters. Your blood is sacred, they tell you. Your blood is pure. Your blood is poison. You are Princess Maria Anna of Austria, and your body is both the crown jewel and the curse of the Habsburg dynasty. You were bred for greatness, sculpted by centuries of careful marriage arrangements between cousins, uncles, and nieces. Each union designed to concentrate power, to keep gold and land within the family, to preserve the sacred bloodline that stretches back to Charlemagne himself. But blood, like wine, can turn sour when kept too long in the same vessel. This is the story of history's most inbred princesses, women worshipped as angels and bred like livestock, painted as goddesses and buried like children. Their bodies were altars upon which empires sacrificed their future, one twisted spine at a time. Hit that subscribe button for more forbidden histories hidden behind palace walls, and drop a comment below where you're listening from. Let's explore these dark corners of royal history together, connected across centuries by our shared fascination with the terrible cost of absolute power. You must understand, to the royal minds of medieval and early modern Europe, marrying within the family wasn't just acceptable, it was divine mathematics. Picture the Habsburg court in 1600 Vienna. Genealogists spread vast charts across oak tables, tracing bloodlines like battle plans. Each marriage wasn't about love or even attraction. It was about preventing dilution. Every drop of royal blood was precious as liquid gold, too valuable to waste on common veins. The logic seemed unassailable. Why share power with strangers when you could multiply it within your own bloodline? Why risk your daughter's children inheriting the wrong nose, the wrong temperament, the wrong claim to succession? Marriage to a cousin guaranteed that every grandchild would carry double the royal heritage, double the legitimacy, double the divine right. The Spanish Habsburgs perfected this art to a horrifying science. For 2 centuries, they married uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, creating a genetic spiral that concentrated not just power, but also recessive traits that should have remained buried in the family's distant past. The French Bourbons followed suit. The Portuguese royals, the English Stuarts before Cromwell's revolution, shattered their careful plans. Each dynasty believed they were preserving something sacred, something that elevated them above mere mortals. But here's what they didn't understand, what no one could understand before the science of genetics emerged centuries later. Blood carries memory, not just of glory and conquest, but of weakness, of malformation, of death itself. Every time cousins married, they weren't just combining their strengths. They were doubling their hidden curses. The cost was always paid by women. Their bodies became laboratories for royal experiments. Their wombs the testing grounds for genetic roulette. Some princesses were lucky enough to be born healthy and die in battle, the battle of childbirth, fighting to produce heirs that might survive their first breath. Others weren't so fortunate. They carried their family's twisted legacy in their bones, their blood, their trembling hands that couldn't hold a goblet without spilling wine like scarlet tears across their silk gowns. Their bodies were cradles and coffins, and the men who arranged their marriages never bothered to ask which they preferred to be. Castile, 1462. You're born into a lie so beautiful and so dangerous that it will define your entire existence. Your name is Juana, though history will know you by your father's epithet, La Beltraneja, after the man who may or may not have planted you in your mother's womb. Your mother, Queen Joan of Portugal, was the second wife of King Henry IV of Castile. But Henry, they whispered, was impotent, cursed, unable to produce the heir that Castile desperately needed. So when Joan began to swell with child, the court buzzed with scandalous speculation. Was the father really the king, or was it Beltrán de la Cueva, the handsome courtier who seemed to spend an unusual amount of time in the queen's private chambers. You'll never know the truth, but your body will carry the evidence. As you grow, observers note peculiarities in your appearance. Your hands, some say, curve inward like claws. Your spine shows signs of curvature that mirrors certain hereditary conditions found in Portuguese royal bloodlines, but not in Castilian ones. Court physicians examine you with the clinical detachment of men studying livestock, measuring the length of your fingers, the width of your skull, searching for signs of legitimacy written in bone and sinew. But here's the cruel irony. Even if you are illegitimate, you've already been claimed by the royal machinery. Treaties have been signed, marriage contracts drafted. Your infant body is already promised to your cousin Alfonso of Portugal, uniting two kingdoms through the political alchemy of arranged marriage. The problem isn't just that you might be a bastard. The problem is that Alfonso is your mother's nephew. If you are legitimate, the marriage will concentrate Portuguese and Castilian blood into a genetic cocktail that could produce miracles or monsters. If you're illegitimate, you're still carrying your mother's Portuguese genes, making this union between close relatives regardless of your father's identity. By the time you're 10, the whispers about your deformities have grown louder. Chroniclers describe hands that cannot properly grip objects, a gait that suggests hip dysplasia, facial features that seem to shift and blur depending on the light. Whether these descriptions are accurate or politically motivated, slander remains unclear, but your body has become a battleground where legitimacy and genetics wage war. The war of the Castilian succession erupts when your supposed father dies. Your half-aunt Isabella claims the throne, supported by nobles who insist you're a bastard. But other factions rally behind you, proclaiming your divine right to rule. Nobody asks what you want. Nobody cares that you're still a child whose body bears the genetic weight of centuries of royal intermarriage. You're passed from one guardian to another, each group of nobles using your malformed hands and uncertain parentage as proof of their political arguments. To Isabella's supporters, your physical imperfections prove God's disapproval of illegitimate rule. To your own faction, these same traits demonstrate the sacred suffering that marks true royalty. At 16, you're finally married to Alfonso of Portugal as planned. The wedding is a grotesque celebration of dynasties that have been intermarrying for generations. Your new husband is not just your cousin. He's also related to you through at least 3 other family connections, making your children's genetic inheritance a mathematical nightmare. You bear one daughter who dies in infancy. The chroniclers don't record the cause, but given the concentrated Portuguese royal blood flowing through her tiny veins, the possibilities are endless, and all of them tragic. Your story ends not with a crown, but with a convent. After Alfonso's death, you retreat to a Portuguese monastery where you spend the remainder of your life as a nun, your twisted hands folded in eternal prayer for sins that were committed against your body long before you had any choice in the matter. History remembers you as a footnote, a pretender who couldn't prove her legitimacy. But the real tragedy is simpler. You were a girl whose DNA was weaponized by men who cared more about bloodlines than the person who had to live within them. Vienna, 1631. You are 7 years old and you cannot speak properly. Words twist in your mouth like broken glass, emerging as wet, incomprehensible sounds that make your tutors exchange worried glances. Your tongue feels too large for your jaw too small for your skull. Everything about your face seems slightly wrong, as if God assembled the features from different patterns. You are Maria Anna of Spain, daughter of Philip III and his beloved wife Margaret of Austria. What the court doesn't openly discuss is that your parents were uncle and niece, their marriage arranged to keep Habsburg blood flowing in concentrated streams through Spanish veins. Your mother was barely 20 when she died giving birth to your younger brother, her body worn down by repeated pregnancies and the genetic burden of bearing children to her own uncle. She left behind 7 children, but only 4 survived infancy. You were one of the fortunate ones, or so they told you. Your childhood unfolds in the Alcazar Palace like a carefully choreographed dance around your disabilities. Speech tutors work with you for hours, their patience wearing thin as you struggle to form even simple words. Your spine curves noticeably to the left, requiring specially constructed corsets that dig into your ribs with every breath. Walking becomes a performance, each step calculated to appear graceful while managing the pain that shoots through your malformed hips. But you are royal. You are Habsburg. Your imperfections must be transformed into divine mystery. Court artists paint your portraits with careful attention to flattering angles. Your twisted spine disappears behind flowing silk gowns. Your speech impediment becomes mysterious reserve, evidence of deep contemplation rather than neurological damage. The propaganda machine of Spanish royalty transforms your genetic curse into ethereal beauty. At 15, you're informed of your betrothal to Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. He is your uncle, your father's brother, making this union another turn of the Habsburg genetic spiral. The marriage contract is signed before you meet him, your malformed body already promised to a man who shares your grandfather's genes. The journey to Vienna becomes your wedding procession, a months-long parade across Europe where foreign courts examine you with the curiosity reserved for exotic animals. Your inability to speak clearly is explained away as Spanish reserve. Your difficulty walking is attributed to the proper modesty of a future empress. Every deformity becomes a virtue through the alchemy of royal spin. Your wedding night isn't romantic, it's imperial taxidermy. You're dressed, positioned, and presented like a doll, your real body hidden beneath layers of ceremony and expectation. Ferdinand, 20 years your senior and bearing his own subtle Habsburg deformities, approaches the marriage as a duty rather than a pleasure. You spend the next 14 years of your life pregnant or recovering from childbirth. Your malformed pelvis makes every delivery a medical crisis. Your genetic legacy, ensuring that many babies don't survive their first breath. When they do survive, they often carry your concentrated Habsburg traits: the jutting jaw, the curved spine, the clouded eyes that seem to look through rather than at the world. The court physicians document your pregnancies with clinical fascination, noting how your body responds to the genetic roulette of Habsburg reproduction. Some babies emerge stillborn, their tiny bodies too twisted to sustain life. Others live for days or weeks before succumbing to the accumulated genetic burden of centuries of royal inbreeding. You produce 6 children who survive to adulthood, but even they carry the visible marks of your shared bloodline. Your daughter, Maria Anna, inherits your spinal curvature. Your son, Leopold, shows early signs of the Habsburg jaw that will define his portraits for posterity. By your late 20s, the accumulated stress of bearing Habsburg children has worn your body down to a brittle shell. Court observers note that you require assistance to walk even short distances. Your speech, never clear, becomes increasingly labored. Your hands shake constantly, making even simple tasks like signing documents a struggle. You die at 29, officially from complications related to your final pregnancy. But the court physician's private notes, preserved in the Vienna archives, paint a more complex picture. The autopsy reveals severe spinal abnormalities, organ displacement caused by your curved ribcage, and evidence of chronic pain that would have made your daily existence a kind of elegant torture. Your funeral becomes a celebration of Habsburg piety and imperial dignity. But stripped of royal ceremony, your story is simpler and more tragic. You were a girl whose DNA was her destiny, whose body became a factory for producing the next generation of genetically compromised rulers. The empire mourned an empress. History should mourn a woman who never had the chance to be anything but a beautiful repository for toxic royal blood. Madrid, 1651. You're born into one of the most famous paintings in history before you can even walk. Diego Velázquez captures you in Las Meninas, a 5-year-old princess with golden hair and knowing eyes, surrounded by dwarfs and dogs and ladies-in-waiting who treat you like a living doll. What the painting doesn't show is how small you really are. Not just young small, but wrong small. At 5, you're the size of a 3-year-old. Your head seems too large for your delicate neck, your eyes too bright for your pale face. Everything about your proportions suggests that growing up will be more struggle than triumph. You are Margaret Theresa of Spain, daughter of King Philip IV and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. But Mariana isn't just your father's wife. She's also his niece, the daughter of his sister, Maria Anna. Your genetic inheritance reads like a mathematical equation, where every variable multiplies the risk of malformation. Your father is 51 when you're born, already showing the advanced signs of Habsburg decay, the protruding jaw that makes eating difficult, the clouded eyes that suggest inbreeding's toll on his nervous system. Your mother is barely 23, but her own body carries the accumulated genetic burden of Austrian Habsburg bloodlines stretching back generations. From your earliest memories, walking feels like balancing on broken stilts. Your spine curves dramatically to the right, requiring servants to help you navigate even simple movements. Your legs don't grow at the same rate, making every step a careful calculation of weight and balance. Court physicians examine you regularly, their hands probing your tiny frame for signs of further deterioration. But you are the Infanta of Spain, and your disabilities must be transformed into divine grace through royal alchemy. Your portraits become exercises in careful deception. Artists paint you standing straight, your curved spine hidden behind flowing silk and ermine. Your small stature becomes childlike charm, rather than evidence of growth disorders. Your pale complexion, caused by the anemia common in heavily inbred populations, becomes aristocratic delicacy. The French court sends delegations to observe you, evaluating your suitability as a potential bride for the young Louis XIV. But even French diplomats, accustomed to their own royal deformities, express private concerns about your obvious physical limitations. Marriage negotiations stall as European courts quietly debate whether your bloodline contains too much Habsburg concentration for safe reproduction. Instead, your betrothal is arranged to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and your own uncle. This isn't unusual. Habsburg marriages typically stayed within the family to preserve bloodline purity. What is unusual is that Leopold himself shows clear signs of genetic deterioration, making your potential offspring a genetic catastrophe waiting to unfold. At 15, you make the journey to Vienna for your wedding, your small body swaying in specially constructed carriages designed to accommodate your spinal deformities. The Viennese court receives you with the mixture of reverence and curiosity reserved for beautiful oddities. Your wedding dress requires extensive alterations to hide the extent of your physical limitations, while still presenting you as a suitable imperial bride. Your wedding night becomes a medical consultation disguised as consummation. Leopold, himself bearing the Habsburg jaw and signs of neurological impairment, approaches marriage as a dynastic duty rather than romantic union. Court physicians stand ready outside your chambers, understanding that Habsburg reproduction has become a high-risk medical procedure rather than a natural biological process. Your pregnancies become exercises in genetic roulette, played with the highest stakes. Your malformed pelvis makes carrying children to term nearly impossible. Your first baby dies within hours of birth, her tiny body too twisted to sustain life outside the womb. Your second pregnancy ends in miscarriage, the fetus so severely malformed that court physicians preserve it in alcohol for future study. You manage to produce one surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, but even she bears the visible marks of concentrated Habsburg genetics. The characteristic jaw, the clouded eyes, the delicate constitution that suggests a shortened lifespan. By your 19th year, the accumulated stress of failed pregnancies and your own genetic limitations has reduced you to a fragile shell of imperial dignity. Court observers note that you spend most days in specially constructed chairs, your curved spine no longer able to support extended periods of standing. Your hands shake constantly, making even simple tasks like signing documents a struggle requiring assistance. Your final pregnancy kills you at 21. The official cause is listed as complications from childbirth, but the reality is more complex. Your body, never designed for the genetic burden it carried, simply couldn't sustain another attempt at Habsburg reproduction. Your funeral becomes a masterpiece of imperial theater. The same artists who painted you as a healthy child now craft your death mask, finally capturing the true extent of the physical deterioration that royal protocol had hidden behind layers of silk and ceremony. Velázquez's painting preserves you forever as the golden-haired child surrounded by dwarfs and dogs. But history should remember you differently, as a girl whose body became a laboratory for royal genetic experiments, whose shortened life measured the true cost of keeping sacred blood too concentrated for human survival. You were never meant to be a person. You were meant to be a beautiful container for toxic royal genetics, admired for your bloodline, and discarded when your body could no longer sustain the burden of Habsburg reproduction. The empire mourned an empress, but they buried a child whose DNA had been her death sentence from the moment of conception. Let's walk through the royal cemetery where the unnamed princesses rest, the ones whose stories never made it into official court histories because their lives were too brief, too tragic, or too obviously cursed for propaganda purposes. Maria Antonia of Austria, born 1669 to Leopold I and Margaret Theresa. By age 11, she's coughing blood into silk handkerchiefs, her lungs damaged by the chest deformities that run in her family like a genetic signature. Court physicians document her case with scientific fascination. Here is Habsburg, inbreeding made visible in child form, a living laboratory of concentrated royal genes. Her marriage to Maximilian Emanuel of Bavaria is arranged when she's 13, her body already showing signs of the internal organ displacement that kills so many Habsburg women during childbirth. The wedding portraits show a pale girl with knowing eyes, her small hands folded to hide the tremor that suggests neurological deterioration. She dies at 27, officially from complications related to her 7th pregnancy. But the private medical records tell a different story. Organs compressed by spinal curvature, chronic respiratory failure, and a reproductive system so damaged by repeated pregnancies that her final childbirth becomes a form of medical torture lasting 3 days. Marie Louise of Spain, another Habsburg experiment in genetic concentration. Born to Charles II, himself so inbred that his mental capacity barely qualified him as functional. Even with one non-Habsburg parent, Marie Louise inherits enough royal genetic burden to make her life a medical curiosity. By 16, she requires assistance eating because her jaw alignment makes chewing difficult. Her spine curves so dramatically that standing for extended periods causes fainting spells. Her reproductive organs develop abnormally, making pregnancy nearly impossible and childbirth potentially fatal. She marries Philip V of Spain in a political arrangement that ignores her obvious physical limitations. The wedding night requires medical supervision, court physicians standing ready to address the complications that everyone expects but no one discusses openly. Marie Louise produces 4 children, but 2 die in infancy from the kind of genetic catastrophes that become routine in royal nurseries. Her own death at 26 comes from intestinal blockage caused by organ displacement. Her malformed ribcage has slowly crushed her internal organs over years of growth. Isabella Clara Eugenia represents the Spanish Habsburgs' final attempt at genetic survival. Born to Philip II and his 4th wife Anna of Austria, Isabella carries the accumulated genetic burden of generations of cousin marriages. Court observers describe her as blind in one eye, sterile in one womb, a poetic summary of how Habsburg inbreeding manifests in female bodies. Her marriage to Archduke Albert of Austria produces no surviving children despite years of attempts. The royal physician's private notes describe a series of miscarriages so severe that Isabella's body becomes a case study in reproductive failure caused by genetic incompatibility. But perhaps most tragic are the unnamed girls, the ones who never received official names because they died too quickly to justify court ceremony. Habsburg family records, preserved in Spanish archives, document dozens of female infants born with deformities so severe that survival was impossible. Some were born without properly formed skulls, their brains exposed to air that killed them within hours. Others had spinal columns so twisted that breathing became impossible. Still others emerged with internal organs arranged in configurations that defied medical understanding of human anatomy. These babies weren't mourned publicly. Their existence would have undermined the divine mythology surrounding Habsburg bloodlines. Instead, they were buried in unmarked graves, their brief lives serving as genetic footnotes to royal marriages that prioritized political alliance over biological reality. The Spanish royal nurseries developed their own protocols for managing these genetic catastrophes. Wet nurses were trained to recognize signs of impending infant death. Court physicians kept detailed records of malformations, creating an unofficial catalogue of Habsburg genetic failures. Some princesses never sat on thrones. They only rested in tiny, silk-lined coffins that became more common than christening gowns in royal nurseries where concentrated bloodlines produced children too damaged for survival. The Habsburg Graveyard stretches across centuries and continents, filled with the bodies of girls whose only crime was inheriting the accumulated genetic burden of royal purity. Their deaths weren't tragedies, they were inevitabilities, the mathematical result of treating human beings like breeding stock designed to preserve political power at the cost of biological viability. By 1800, European royal courts could no longer ignore what their marriage policies had created. A genetic disaster spanning centuries and continents, written in the bodies of princesses who died too young and princes too damaged to rule effectively. The Habsburg jaw, once celebrated as a mark of divine bloodline, was finally recognized as mandibular prognathism, a genetic condition that worsens with each generation of cousin marriage. The pale complexion that artists painted as aristocratic delicacy was actually anemia caused by the blood disorders common in heavily inbred populations. Those graceful curved spines that required custom corsets weren't evidence of refined breeding. They were scoliosis, a skeletal malformation that intensified when recessive genes had no healthy alternatives to mask their expression. Charles II of Spain became the poster child for royal genetic failure, but the women in his family tree carried the same toxic inheritance with less public documentation. While Charles's mental incapacity and physical deformities made him a historical curiosity, the princesses who shared his bloodline suffered in private, their reproductive failures dismissed as divine will rather than genetic inevitability. Modern genetic analysis of Habsburg family trees reveals inbreeding coefficients that would be illegal in livestock breeding. The Spanish branch of the family, after 2 centuries of uncle-niece and cousin marriages, had reduced genetic diversity to levels typically seen in laboratory populations bred for experimental purposes. The coefficient of inbreeding for the final generation of Spanish Habsburgs approached 25%, meaning these royal children had the genetic diversity of offspring produced by siblings. In animal breeding, such levels reliably produce the kind of deformities and early death that plagued Habsburg nurseries for generations. Hemophilia, the bleeding disorder that would later devastate European royalty through Queen Victoria's descendants, was just one example of how recessive genetic traits became dominant when royal bloodlines concentrated too intensely. But hemophilia was relatively merciful. It typically killed male heirs quickly, sparing them years of suffering. The Habsburg genetic legacy was more cruel. Their recessive traits tended to produce conditions that made life possible but miserable. Spinal deformities that caused chronic pain, jaw malformations that made eating difficult, reproductive abnormalities that turned childbirth into Russian roulette with genetic catastrophe. The princesses bore the worst of this genetic burden because their bodies became the testing grounds for royal reproduction. While male heirs could sometimes overcome their physical limitations through political power, princesses lived or died based on their ability to successfully bear the next generation of genetically compromised rulers. Court physicians began keeping detailed medical records that read like catalogs of genetic horrors. Infant mortality rates in royal nurseries approached 50%, not from disease or accident, but from the kind of birth defects that occur when gene pools become dangerously shallow. The Spanish Habsburg line ended not with war or revolution, but with simple biological failure. Charles II, despite multiple marriages, produced no surviving heirs. His body, the final product of centuries of genetic concentration, simply couldn't sustain reproduction. The dynasty died with him, victim of its own obsession with bloodline purity. But Charles wasn't alone in his genetic isolation. Across Europe, royal families were discovering that their careful marriage policies had created genetic dead ends. The very strategies designed to preserve royal power were eliminating royal fertility, making dynasties extinct through the mathematical inevitability of inbreeding depression. The princesses who survived this genetic catastrophe often lived as invalids, their bodies too damaged by inherited defects to function normally but too royal to be dismissed from court. They became living monuments to the failure of treating human beings like livestock, beautiful reminders that blood purity and genetic health exist in fundamental opposition. Science didn't create these tragedies. It simply provided the vocabulary to describe what European royalty had been doing to their own children for centuries. The mathematical precision of genetics revealed the true cost of political marriages that prioritized alliance over biology. The real curse wasn't supernatural. It was statistical, as predictable as any other outcome. When small populations reproduce exclusively within their own genetic boundaries for multiple generations. Picture the final Habsburg princess, nameless in the official records because she lived only 3 days. Born in 1700 to parents who were uncle and niece, first cousins, and connected through 4 other family lines that genealogists trace like threads in a tapestry of genetic catastrophe. She emerged from her mother's womb with a spine so curved that her ribcage couldn't expand properly for breathing. Her skull had fused incorrectly, creating pressure on a brain that would never develop normally. Her internal organs were arranged in positions that made survival impossible outside the controlled environment of the womb. The court physicians documented her case with clinical fascination, measuring the angles of her deformities and preserving tissue samples for future study. But they never recorded her name. She died too quickly to justify the ceremony of royal christening, her brief life serving as the final proof that Habsburg bloodlines had become toxic to human survival. This unnamed princess represents the ultimate truth about royal inbreeding. It wasn't supernatural forces that twisted these girls' bodies and shortened their lives. It wasn't divine punishment or mysterious curses. It was mathematics, as predictable and inevitable as any other scientific law. For 3 centuries, European royalty had conducted a genetic experiment using their own daughters as test subjects. They bred for political convenience rather than biological compatibility, treating human reproduction like a strategy game where the pieces happened to be living girls whose bodies bore the consequences of each poorly calculated move. They said these princesses were cursed, that God had marked them for suffering because of ancestral sins or political ambitions. But the real curse was simpler and more mundane. It was men who valued bloodline purity more than the health of their children, who saw marriage as a tool for concentrating power rather than ensuring genetic diversity. The curse was kings who looked at their daughters' twisted spines and saw political opportunities rather than medical emergencies. It was courts that celebrated genetic disasters as divine mysteries, painting deformities as aristocratic grace while girls died in agony from reproductive systems too damaged to sustain life. These princesses weren't monsters. They were the victims of monstrous policies, human beings sacrificed to the altar of dynastic ambition by men who confused genetic concentration with political strength. History remembers the kings and their wars, their conquests and their grand political alliances. But the true horror of European royalty played out in nurseries where genetic roulette was disguised as divine will, in birthing chambers where the accumulated sins of centuries of cousin marriage were paid by girls whose only crime was inheriting the toxic legacy of royal blood. The Habsburg jaw, the curved spines, the failed pregnancies, the early deaths, these weren't mysterious afflictions. They were the predictable results of treating human genetics like a closed system designed to preserve political power at any biological cost. Some of these princesses lived long enough to understand what had been done to them. Others died too young to comprehend the genetic lottery they'd lost before birth. But all of them paid the price for policies that valued royal pedigree more than human survival. Their bodies became monuments to the failure of bloodline obsession, beautiful and tragic reminders that power concentrated too intensely becomes poison, whether it flows through political institutions or human veins. The men who arranged their marriages created these genetic disasters through policy decisions that prioritized short-term political advantage over long-term biological reality. They painted their daughters' suffering as divine mystery because acknowledging the truth would have required admitting that royal blood wasn't sacred, it was just human, subject to the same genetic laws that govern every other living thing. In the end, these princesses weren't cursed by witches or punished by gods. They were killed by the mathematics of inbreeding, victims of men who believed political power could override biological reality through the simple expedient of calling genetic disasters divine will. Their twisted spines tell the real story of European royalty, not one of divinely appointed rulers, but of human beings who forgot that even kings and queens are subject to the laws of genetics, and that some prices are too high to pay, even for a crown. If you want to hear the full tragic story of Mariana of Austria, the most inbred queen in European history, watch this video next.